In this video, we'll take you on a journey through time, showing how the American dream transformed from a fight for survival into a reality of comfort and prosperity. You'll be shocked to see just how much has changed in a few hundred years. Ever wondered what it was like to live in a house where you could barely turn around without bumping into someone? Well, welcome to the average American home in the 1700s. Picture this: a tiny wooden structure with just 2 or 3 rooms, drafty and creaky, but somehow managing to house an entire extended family. It's enough to make our modern apartments feel like mansions. Now, we're not just talking about mom, dad, and a couple of kids here. Oh no, this was a full-on family reunion every single day. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even farm hands all crammed into this tight space. Can you imagine trying to sneak a midnight snack with your great-aunt snoring on the other side of the room? Speaking of sleeping arrangements, forget about having your own bed. In those days, people shared beds like we share Netflix accounts now. It wasn't uncommon to have 3 or 4 people piled into one bed, all in the name of staying warm and saving space. Talk about awkward. And if you were the unlucky one stuck in the middle, good luck getting up for a bathroom break without waking the whole house. But wait, it gets better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. Most homes only had one fireplace, which meant that in the winter, everyone huddled around it like penguins in a snowstorm. It was the 18th century version of fighting over the thermostat, except instead of arguing about whether it should be 70 or 72 degrees, it was more like, "Move over, I can't feel my toes." Summer wasn't exactly a picnic either. With no air conditioning, those crowded homes turned into veritable saunas. Imagine being packed in with your whole family, plus the heat and humidity of a July afternoon. It's no wonder people spent so much time outside. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or should we say, the chamber pot in the corner. That's right, indoor plumbing was still a far-off dream for most Americans in the 1700s. Instead, families used chamber pots, which were essentially buckets that everyone used as a toilet. And here's the kicker: they weren't emptied all that often. Can you imagine the smell? It's enough to make you grateful for even the most basic bathroom. Privacy? What privacy? In these cramped quarters, the concept was about as foreign as a smartphone. Need to have a heart-to-heart with your spouse? Good luck finding a quiet corner where Uncle Bob isn't eavesdropping. Want to write in your diary? You'd better hope your nosy little sister isn't reading over your shoulder. And let's not forget about personal space. In today's world, we're used to having our own rooms, our own closets, maybe even our own bathrooms. But back then, personal space was measured in inches, not feet. Your closet might have been a single peg on the wall where you hung your one good shirt. Your dresser could have been a shared trunk at the foot of the bed. Mealtimes must have been quite the production, too. Imagine trying to coordinate dinner for a dozen or more people in a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. It was probably less like cooking and more like conducting a very chaotic, very crowded orchestra. But you know what? Despite all these challenges, families in the 1700s made it work. They had to be resourceful, patient, and above all, really good at getting along with each other. In a way, maybe all that togetherness fostered a sense of community that we sometimes miss in our more spread-out modern lives. Speaking of survival, did you know that in 1700s America, blowing out 40 candles on your birthday cake was a rare feat? Let's take a stomach-churning journey through a time when even a tiny cut could mean curtains, and childbirth was as dangerous as facing a grizzly bear. Life in the 1700s was like playing a never-ending game of Dodge the Reaper. Most folks didn't even make it to their mid-30s. Can you imagine that? Today, we're planning our next vacation at 35, but back then, you'd be considered a wise old sage if you made it that far. Now, why was staying alive such a challenge? Well, let's just say that disease was the uninvited guest at every colonial party. Smallpox, cholera, and dysentery were like the mean girls of the 18th century. They could wipe out entire communities faster than you can say George Washington's wooden teeth. And if you did get sick, oh boy, you were in for a wild ride. Medical practices back then were about as sophisticated as using a hammer to fix a watch. Bloodletting was all the rage, which is just a fancy way of saying, let's drain the sick person's blood and hope for the best. Spoiler alert, it usually didn't work out so well. But wait, there's more. Even if you managed to dodge the big scary diseases, something as simple as a paper cut could send you to meet your maker. Without antibiotics, infections spread faster than gossip at a quilting bee. A tiny scratch could turn into a life-threatening situation quicker than you could say, pass the leeches. Now, let's talk about the kiddos. If you thought raising children today was tough, imagine living in a time when losing multiple children before they reached adulthood was tragically common. Parents in the 1700s had to be tougher than old leather just to cope with the heartbreak. And childbirth? Let's just say it was no walk in the park. Many women faced childbirth with the same fear we might feel skydiving without a parachute. Complications during or after birth claimed the lives of countless mothers, leaving families devastated and struggling to carry on. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just the big, scary diseases that could do you in. Even a simple cold or fever could be a one-way ticket to the great beyond. Things we brush off today with some chicken soup and Netflix binge-watching were potential death sentences back then. Now, don't get me wrong. Our colonial ancestors weren't dropping like flies every day, but they did live with a constant awareness that each sunrise could be their last. It's like they were all starring in their own personal survival reality show, minus the $1 million prize at the end. So, the next time you pop an aspirin for a headache or slap a Band-Aid on a cut, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. In the 1700s, you'd be lucky to have a neighbor with some willow bark to chew on or a scrap of clean cloth to wrap around your wound. Ever wondered why they called it the daily grind back in the 1700s? Well, buckle up, because we're about to take you on a journey through a workday that would make even the most dedicated modern employee break out in a cold sweat. For our American ancestors in the 18th century, work wasn't just something you did from 9 to 5, it was a way of life that consumed almost every waking hour. And we're not talking about sitting at a desk, answering emails, or attending meetings. No, sir. This was hard, physical labor that started before the rooster even thought about crowing and didn't end until long after the sun had called it quits for the day. Picture this. You're a farmer, because let's face it, most people were back then. Your alarm clock? The sun peeking over the horizon. Your first task of the day? Probably milking the cows or feeding the chickens. And that's just the warm-up. From there, you might spend hours plowing fields by hand, planting crops, or harvesting whatever was in season. And let's not forget about the livestock. They needed constant attention too. But wait, there's more. Remember those kiddos running around? Well, in the 1700s, they weren't just adorable little bundles of joy. They were part of the workforce too. That's right, children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to pitch in with chores. So while little Timmy today might complain about having to make his bed, back then he'd be out fetching water or helping in the fields. Talk about a tough childhood. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least city folk had it easier, right? Wrong. If you were lucky enough to be a craftsman in an urban area, you'd spend long hours in workshops, often in conditions that would make modern OSHA inspectors faint on the spot. Imagine spending your entire day hunched over a workbench with poor lighting and no air conditioning. And forget about lunch breaks. You'd be lucky to grab a quick bite between tasks. But hold on to your bonnets, folks, because we haven't even gotten to the women yet. Ladies, if you think juggling a career and household chores is tough today, prepare to gain a whole new appreciation for your great-great-great-grandmothers. In addition to helping with farming or crafts, women were responsible for all the household chores. And we're not just talking about running a vacuum cleaner or throwing a load of laundry in the washing machine. No, these superheroes of the 1700s were making clothes from scratch. That's right. They'd spin the yarn, weave the fabric, and then sew the garments by hand. And don't even get us started on food preservation. With no refrigerators or freezers, Women had to find creative ways to make sure their families had enough to eat during the harsh winter months. Canning, pickling, smoking, you name it, they did it. Oh, and let's not forget about childcare. With large families being the norm, there was always a baby to feed, a toddler to chase, or a scraped knee to tend to. The division of labor was pretty stark back then. While men were out in the fields or working their trades, women were expected to manage the household and children. It was a rigid structure that left little room for personal pursuits or me time. In fact, the idea of having time for hobbies or relaxation would have seemed as foreign to them as smartphones or air travel. So, the next time you're feeling overworked after a long day at the office, just remember, at least you're not up at dawn to milk the cows before a 14-hour day in the fields. Our ancestors in the 1700s were working from sunrise to sunset just to ensure their survival. It puts our modern work-life balance struggles into perspective, doesn't it? Ever wondered how drastically different life was for the average American just a few centuries ago? Well, buckle up, because we're about to take you on a wild ride through time. Back in the 1700s, our ancestors were basically working machines. From sunrise to sunset, they toiled away, barely catching a break. Can you imagine working that long every single day? Fast forward to today, and we're clocking in around 40 hours a week. Talk about a major upgrade. But here's the real kicker. Despite all the hardships our 18th century counterparts faced, we're living like kings and queens in comparison. The comfort, safety, and longevity we enjoy today would have blown their minds. It's like we're living in a sci-fi movie compared to their daily grind. So, next time you're relaxing on your comfy couch, binge watching your favorite show, or even just flipping on a light switch, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Our ancestors would be amazed at the life of luxury we're living.